With the Peach Fairy and the Gold Ochre, we've got really warm colors, and so bringing in a cool color at this time, brings something really beautiful into the painting. I'm celebrating World Watercolor Month with a new video every day in July. Today I want to create a large version of a subject I've been working on in smaller variations over the last few months. I'm very interested in this view overlooking the rolling hills of my landscape and figuring out how to interpret it in a larger version, which is always a challenge. I'm working with Rockwell watercolors, and my paper, I believe, is Arches 140 pound cold press. Because I want to start loosely, I'm going to start with some watercolor sticks though. This is a watercolor stick from Daniel Smith. And I'm just going to create some placeholders for positioning my landscape. Those low rolling hills, something I can loosely use as a framework. I like holding my watercolor stick or a water-soluble crayon or a pencil very loosely in my hand and creating kind of what I like to think of as seeking marks, letting them kind of skip across the paper. I had dipped my watercolor stick in water so it would just release a little bit more freely onto the paper instead of being quite so firm and rough like a firm crayon. And as it kind of soaks in some of that moisture, you can see it. It gets a little darker. I get a little on my fingers, smear it around. This is a place to be a little untidy and just get those kind of, what would I say, overall loose marks. I want to start from a position of looseness because that is what's going to be the most, well, you want to work from the foundation you've begun. I'm not going to start out tight and rigid and detailed and then get looser. That doesn't really work for me. With a little of that graphite colored watercolor stick on my fingers, I can use a wet finger to kind of start to release and smudge some of that beautiful watercolor that's already on the paper. My goal here also is to be very intuitive in my approach. I think about this as a way of kind of relying on muscle memory because, and I have no idea why I'm clapping there, because having painted this multiple times, I have in my brain, in my history, this subject. And so as I come into this to paint it again, I want it to be fresh, I want it to be different. But I also want to trust that all of the things that I've done in the past have been internalized and I can release those out onto the paper. I can trust my intuition and what the painting needs is going to emerge. This is a color called Peach Fairy from Rockwell. I think of it as it is a pink, but it's a lovely kind of murky violet pink. It's very soft. And my sky, I've sprayed it, so the sky is very soft. We've got a lot of flow happening, and then it's going. That spray of water is touching the edge of the landscape as well. So I get to create. At this point, I'm thinking about creating a color palette. It's very soft and muted. It has that lovely delicacy to it. Now I'm bringing in some gold ochre into the sky, and let those colors flow together. The brush I'm using is from Lebenzon Paintbrushes, and I'll put a link for all of these supplies down in the description below the video. I like a big brush like this, especially for this size of painting. Scaling up is always really challenging because with the paper being bigger, everything else needs to be bigger as well. If you're using a small brush, your brush strokes are going to not fill the page as well, and so you have to change the way you handle your brush. There's just a lot that kind of goes into scaling up, and that can create a learning curve for this larger size. And that would be why I would suggest, if you're going to start scaling up your paintings, scale up slowly. Go 50% bigger, don't go 250% bigger. I'm really focused on angle right now, getting some of that flow to happen in that upper part of the sky. First layers of a painting are generally the layers where you want more fluidity. And so using that gravity to help you out there and working with lots of water. I love this shade of gold ochre and that combination with the lovely violet pink peach fairy. You know, just the painting at this stage feels calm and beautiful, just the way it is. When I think about a landscape strategy, I'm generally thinking about horizontal lines and gradual diagonals. And so you'll see, watch my brush as I paint through this subject and notice how often I'm working on that slight diagonal or bringing that back and forth motion of those horizontal lines. The diagonal brings you forward into this to the foreground, and the horizontals give you those horizons and kind of anchor the painting. I'm dropping in, I believe this is the Lapis Brown. So it's a beautiful, cool brown, and just bringing in a little bit of an earth tone. And with the, I feel like and now some cobalt blue. With the peach fairy and the gold ochre, we've got really warm colors. And so bringing in a cool color at this time, you know, brings something really beautiful into the painting and brings that contrasting temperature. I know I've worked with cobalt blue many, many times, so I know how much I like it in a painting. I know how it brings a little, to me, cobalt blue often brings a little pop of delight into the painting. So I love grabbing it partway through and introducing it a little pop of pure cobalt blue, and then mixing it to create some really lovely subdued neutrals. Mixing it with a burnt umber or a burnt sienna, something brownish, will give a beautiful gray. And I want to point out as well that I'm not rushing here. There's a lot of fluidity here, so I do need to be aware of how my painting is drying. If I want to add these fluid marks like I'm adding right now, I need to do that before my sky dries completely. And waiting like this means that I have just a little bit slower movement of the paint than I would have if I'd added some of those lovely violets a few minutes ago. So I held off. I painted some of the lower part of the painting, and then I came back to the sky as it started to dry. The fine, thin lines that my Lebenzon brush creates are really beautiful for suggesting grass, twigs, bushes, and I'm being kind of suggestive in this study. There's going to be a lot left unsaid, and we're going to focus on those lovely flows of color and that beautiful mark making. When I've done some fairly crisp lines and mark making, my spray bottle is actually a wonderful tool to release some of those marks and soften them into the rest of the painting. You kind of melt those shapes into the painting. They don't disappear completely. If I were to use my brush to scrub those lines, you know, then I would start to lose those shapes. But the spray bottle will release their shapes and soften them, while those original kind of maybe a ghost mark of that original line will still be present. Back to the cobalt blue. I'm babysitting the hillside here and bringing in some richer blue as those first marks, those first cool lines of cobalt started to blend into the painting. And often I'll do this with a painting too. Those first colors that you place tend to dry a little paler, come back and build up that second layer of color and just make it a little bit darker and richer. Here in this corner, working with a lot of fluidity and echoing the colors that are in the rest of the painting, it just brings so much harmony to the painting to have those soft flows in the same colors that are echoing what's going on in the line. and stronger shapes of the scene. Placing just really lovely scribbly marks. I love a good scribbly mark, and letting it bleed into the wet paper. And just a little back and forth. I'm going to make this corner a little bit darker so that in contrast the right side of the paper has a bit more of a glow. Now feels like a good time to try the watercolor stick and just see if I can echo some of what I did in the very first marks of this painting. Echoing harmony and rhythm and repetition, they're design elements. And so I talk about this idea of echoing, and it is an artistic design principle. Creating, some variety, but then also coming back and repeating different motifs or elements that you started off with. And if you're thinking about painting as poetry or music, perhaps you can see some comparisons there to strategies a musician might use to write a song or a poet might use in writing a poem. There are certain, just stylistic decisions that you make that help the areas with variety to sing all the more strongly, to create a mood or a certain feeling for your scene. One thing I haven't done at this point is created some strong marks. So I'm giving that a try right now just to see how that feels. I know myself, and I do have a tendency to create a lot of tiny fussy marks when a big painting really should be anchored around some bigger, stronger overall strokes. And so just working with a little bit of larger mark making and now releasing it again. Just trying to get a feel for what works in the painting, what do I want to let go of a little bit. And there's no shame in trying a big mark and then releasing it with that spray bottle. Having a strong, bold mark in that lower corner might distract from what's in the back of the painting, what's towards the middle, moving our eyes toward those hills. And so I keep that in mind and pay attention to where my eyes travel. I've picked up a little bit of the graphite pigment from the watercolor stick with my brush, so I can use it to, well, you can see I'm both drawing with my right hand and painting with my left in the same color, just to create a variety of delicate and stronger, bolder marks. Watercolor sticks are the same pigment as you would have in your watercolor tubes. It's drier, it's compressed, and so you're actually getting, I think, more pigment than you would find in a tube in one watercolor stick. That makes them really nice for traveling with, although personally I do like the way, if I'm squeezing my paint from the tube into my watercolor palette, the pigment's just a little bit softer. The watercolor sticks are quite firm. I'm mixing a combination of the bluish brown that I have, that obsidian or lapis brown, and the cobalt and the gold ochre, just to get something that's kind of got a hint of green in it. It's a change of color from what we started with, but it's also the same colors I've been using. They're just mixed to get that green, and I'm going to try that out and bring that color into the painting here. Flicking with the brush to create some drops. That feels a little bit strong. So here comes the spray bottle again. I try not to think about the fact that I'm placing pigment and that's releasing off to the edge of the painting. It's not lost because I sprayed it and let it flow off. Little tendrils, little sheen of dilute pigment is still left on the paper. There starts to become this beautiful complexity of diluted color. and I can trust that what's still there is what needs to be there. And you can see just how wet the paper is as I place these strokes of gold ochre into that lower corner. The upper parts of the painting are drying, and the lower part is still very fluid. And again, placing some of that gold ochre, some of the peach fairy. I'm really enjoying having these colors in my Rockwell palette. Here you can see how dark that Lapis Brown is. Just darkening that corner further. I mentioned earlier that I wanted it to be a little darker there, get some of those lights illuminating in the right-hand side of the painting. And then again, just releasing, giving that color the room to flow a little bit. The last thing I do when I'm painting, when I walk away to let something dry, is I blot up any excess moisture that's flowing to the edge of the page. I like to dry my painting on a slight angle so that excess moisture doesn't pool. You can see how parts of the paper are buckled. And so I could easily have a pool of water towards the middle. And rather I want to tilt a little bit so excess moisture flows to the edge. And then I blot as much of that as I can before I walk away and let it dry. Just bringing back another little hint of that lovely red violet. And we're going to wrap this up and call it done. I love the understated beauty of this painting. And in truth, this painting doesn't exist anymore. I kept painting and I'm not happy with how it ended. So I'm just enjoying watching the process and seeing how lovely it is to have it at this stage of this minimalistic delicacy, and making a mental note that that's where I want my intuition to take me as I think about creating future versions of this same painting. Thanks for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with more watercolor advice you can learn from. Don't forget to include the hashtag World Watercolor Month when you participate and post watercolor art in July.